Okay, that was amazing that the tech actually worked. Let's hope it continues. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Rachael Greaves. And this paper is also pre-recorded, and unfortunately Rachael won't be joining us today, so we won't be having a Q&A after this one. So Rachael Greaves is a records and information management thought leader. Rachael has consulted on large-scale records, security and audit projects in government and regulated industries with complex integrated environments, and developed Castle Point in response to the tension seen in organisations between compliance, usability, sustainability and cost. With a cultural anthropology and linguistics background, Rachael brings ethical, global and sustainable practices to the sector. Her innovative technology concept has transformed the compliance and risk management outcomes of multiple organisations by automating the application of complex and multi-layered regulatory obligations to their data holdings. Rachael's mission is to improve outcomes for citizens and stakeholders by helping governments and organisations to provide better, more accountable services. Rachael's talk is called The Changing Role of the Archivist and Records Manager in the Age of AI and Automation. Can we now please play Rachael's pre-recording?
The international standard ISO16175 for information and documentation has recently changed to require something drastically different: invisible and automated records management. Does this make archivists and records managers invisible too? And does it automate us out of a job? My name is Rachael Greaves. I'm a certified information professional, certified information systems auditor, certified information security manager, certified data privacy systems engineer, and I'm certified in project change and records management. I've consulted on large-scale record security and audit projects in government and regulated industries with complex integrated environments for the last 12 years. And I developed the Castle Point platform in response to the tension found in organisations between compliance, usability, sustainability and cost. I spent my career auditing some of the largest government departments and the most complex networks for information security, privacy and records management compliance. I was consistently failing and cancelling programs with investments ranging from hundreds of thousands to billions of dollars. They all failed for the same reasons. They weren't managing the risk that was hiding in their records. I can't talk about many of my audits, but I can share insights about governance failures that are in the public domain. If we can understand them, we'll not be doomed to repeat them. That will ultimately mean improved outcomes for citizens and stakeholders. And understanding them also helps us understand how and why the expectations of regulators and the community have shifted, and what that means for the profession. Archivists and records managers have been fighting a losing battle using traditional technologies and processes since the advent of the digital age. Some of the more critical failures of records management have been newsworthy. The failure of Donald Trump's team to protect and preserve records is an obvious one, but you may also have heard of the Windrush generation, Caribbean immigrants to the UK who had all their landing card records destroyed by the Home Office records team to save space, resulting in many being unlawfully deported. Or the breach of the Australian National University in 2018, when 19 years of staff and student records were taken by a foreign government, 60% of which had been over-retained by the records team and should have already been destroyed, including mine. Keeping records too long has also affected Optus recently, who spilled more than 9 million records, many of which they probably did not need to be keeping. Keeping records for too short a time has affected the chances of reparations for the stolen generations, Maralinga atomic testing survivors, and child sexual abuse victim survivors in private and government institutions. We can see that proper retention management is a serious responsibility and one we're not doing well by any measure. But records managers are not just in charge of sentencing and disposal. We're also responsible for making sure records are complete and accurate by providing systems that are easy to use and update. When we fail to do that, we see the death of Paul Maguire in the Grasstree mine, sent to a dangerous location where he was overwhelmed by gases because the safety records hadn't been updated. Or the deaths of 8 people when the San Bruno pipeline exploded in the USA because its records were incorrect. We know that useful, usable record systems can be the difference between life and death. Finally, we're the ones who are responsible for making information accessible and discoverable to the right people at the right time. When we fail to do this, there are grave consequences. The UK National Common Intelligence Application database held around 400 pieces of missed information about the man who would become the Manchester Arena terrorist bomber, killing 22 people and injuring more than 800, most of them children. The system was unstable and officers reported that it was just too hard to search. A report found the attack was preventable with better information discovery and linkage. In April this year, Medicare scrapped backlogged medical record requests for the previous 6 months, affecting around 2,400 people who may need those records for insurance claims or to access the National Redress Scheme for child abuse, also saying their systems were just too hard to search. So let's look at 2 cases in detail where a centralised record system, hard to use and hard to search, was the cause of 2 vulnerable women being dispossessed. 2 cases which I believe were a catalyst for the abandonment of EDRMS as the preferred model of government. Vivian Alvarez Salon was an extremely vulnerable Australian citizen, found with a head injury in a park in Lismore. She'd been missing from Brisbane for about 6 weeks at this time, having failed to pick up her 5-year-old from childcare one afternoon. She was already known to police as at risk, but she was not listed as a missing person for several months. The information about her prior history and her listing as a missing person was never picked up by the Department of Immigration, DMIA at the time. They took her into custody and removed it to the Philippines in July 2001, despite her telling officials she was an Australian citizen and telling them her ex-husband's name, Young, as well, despite her vulnerable status and the fact that people were looking for her. She was handed over to some nuns and left in a hospice for the dying and destitute in Manila. Her son was placed in foster care. This story became a human rights disaster, and what happened next led to a formal inquiry. That inquiry was then coupled to another inquiry, this time about another vulnerable woman, an Australian citizen again, also with a mental illness, also found wandering. Cornelia Rao was locked in immigration detention, and it turns out it was the same record-keeping failures that put her there. We can contextualise these failures by first considering another audit, this time of the Department of Health. They'd spent 9 years and about $5 million implementing the same EDRMS system as that used by DMIA. And when the audit office audited that project, they asked some newly trained users to find 100 documents that were known to be in the system. They found only 18. The department effectively lost over 80% of their records when they moved them out of their original context and into that undiscoverable record-keeping system. Vivian herself languished in the Philippines for 2 years. Then someone from the State Missing Persons Bureau contacted DMIA about her. DMIA staff in Canberra searched their record systems and made the link. They knew then that a citizen had been deported. They told their supervisor on July 14, 2003. Nothing was done. It took more than a year and a half after this for Vivian to be found. So what went wrong in the first place? How did a citizen whose records were clearly in the system get unlawfully removed? A clue came from one of the last social workers to interact with Vivian in Australia, who said, "This one, it just really baffled me because they said they couldn't find any paperwork or documentation about her." We must dig into the Comrie report, the formal inquiry into this event, to get to the bottom of this. The report says, "The inquiries made in an attempt to identify Vivian were ad hoc and symptomatic of a situation in which DMIA officers had been inadequately trained for their role as compliance officers, particularly in relation to the interrogation of IT systems and databases. There were on DMIA's TRIM database details that would have linked the name Alvarez to the names Salon and Young, but these were not accessed by compliance officers. DMIA had incorrectly recorded Vivian's middle name, Alvarez, as her last name. When the police contacted DMIA about her in July 2001, the report found that despite the fact that on that very day Vivian was being held in detention in a Brisbane motel, the limited name connectivity of DMIA databases did not allow for the association of these names. A major opportunity to prevent Vivian's removal was lost. A deep dive into the databases showed they were simply not discoverable. Each of the 4 databases containing Vivian's information used different search systems, which each had significant limitations. Staff had been told, for example, not to search TRIM's notes fields, which contain the middle name last name link, because they slowed network performance. There was no way to search multiple systems at once or to search all fields or terms in each system. The systems were unusable and unintuitive, and staff weren't trained properly to use the workarounds. There were terrible cultural issues as well, obviously, but the limitations of the EDRMS and its lack of interconnectivity with the line of business systems meant that none of the databases could really be relied on. They were used only for decision recording. They couldn't be used for decision support. This was a watershed moment in government accountability for record keeping. Let's consider a timeline of what followed so we can understand how we got to today. Vivian and Cornelia's inquiries were made public in 2005. They focused mainly on the cultural issues, but also had specific findings related to records management systems and process. The Australian National Audit Office had previously issued reports on Commonwealth records management in 2002 and 2003, which both pointed out that business systems were proliferating unmanaged. But in October 2006, the year after the inquiries, they released a performance audit focused on record keeping, including the management of electronic records specifically. In April 2007, the Auditor General, Ian McPhee, followed up with a speech about records in government at the National Archives seminar, saying, "There's probably no single reason why there's an increasing focus on the importance of maintaining good records. Certainly, some not so flattering coverage about the consequences of poor record keeping has helped, but more broadly, there's been an increasing recognition about the gap between the explosion in the quantum and types of information that we now generate and the systems and practices traditionally used to manage information." This was the first sign that expectations about what made a fit-for-purpose system were changing. The ANAO increasingly addressed electronic records management in its audits subsequently. Instead of just a background part of audits, it became the focus for the first time ever. ANAO audited Centrelink's record keeping in 2006, the Department of Veterans Affairs record keeping in 2009, broader public service record keeping again in 2012, specifically Customs, Immigration and the Commonwealth Treasury, who we can return to later, Defence's personnel record keeping in 2015, and records management in the Department of Health in 2015. Some departments took steps to respond to the findings. After the Comrie and Palmer reports, the Immigration Department embarked on a more than $750 million business transformation program over 5 years called Systems for People, to provide staff with a single view of all the departments dealing with a client and support proper record keeping. But a capability review in 2012 found that the Systems for People program was widely viewed by staff as over-promising and under-delivering. As one stakeholder commented, the department has fragmented client information, and even if the information is there, they can't find it. The report pointed out that immigration was still at high risk of another unlawful deportation or detention. So we understood the problem well, but it was clearly hard to fix, even with $750 million. This kind of wastage and catastrophes like Ceylon and Rao is what has eventually led us to the manage in place AI expectation for records. A harbinger of the shift from EDRMS to manage in place came from the Federal Government Management Advisory Committee, who released a paper in 2007 called Note for File, where they still recommended centralised EDRMS for all unstructured records in an organisation, but accepted that structured systems at least would need to be managed in place. They also recommended lifting the record-keeping burden from users in an early nod towards the automated future. The National Archives Digital Transition Policy was released in 2011, requiring records in all business systems to start to be managed properly, either by being duplicated to, integrated with, or archived into an EDRMS at end of life. But this wasn't sufficient to drive change, as evidenced by reported checkup results over the next several years, and all those ANAO audits. In October 2015, the Department of Finance intervened, starting a plan for a whole-of-government EDRMS. The initial finance recommendation was that to effectively manage growth, record keeping should happen automatically in the background, rather than being the responsibility of end users. In 2016, Finance released a request for information focused on getting input from the vendor community on the costs, risks and benefits to the Australian Government of moving agencies to a single or reduced number of EDRMS. It also asked for suggestions for other innovative approaches to the whole of Australian Government management of digital records to support the digital transformation agenda and the NAA target for digital continuity. We responded to that question with our newly developed paradigm, suggesting that using a simple central tool to apply records management to many systems in the agency via loose coupling is likely to be the lowest cost way to ensure the records in those systems are effectively managed. It minimises the technical risk of trying to modify, tightly integrate or export data from line of business systems that were never intended to perform these functions. Automating the process of registering, classifying, sentencing and reviewing business system records from a single system helps records managers to take control of all the holdings of the business via a single pane of glass. Finance did not accept at this time that that would be a suitable approach. And in 2017, they announced the Digital Records Transformation Initiative in the federal budget, planning a whole-of-government digital records platform that would act as a shared service EDRMS, with classification built into it. In 2018, Finance started to build their own solution using machine learning, having decided that the technologies emerging in the market weren't suited to its needs. This approach was eventually also abandoned, and there was a change of management and strategy for the DRTI. At the end of the year, the department pivoted to plan a whole-of-government sourcing strategy instead, essentially a panel of records management vendors, but, quote, taking advantage of new technologies, particularly those that automate the capture and classification of the records. By 2020, the pivot to manage in place was committed as federal government default policy. Finance released requirements to market for automated capture and classification of records with minimal user intervention, full enterprise search, and the ability to manage in place rather than saving a record into a separate business system, the loose coupling model we'd put forward in 2016. Also in 2020, the international standard ISO16175 was updated to treat obligations for all systems the same, whether they were designed specifically for records management or not. It also now states that records management should be largely invisible to end users. End users should not interact with complex functionality specific to requirements of records professionals, and that metadata should be automatically generated wherever possible. So records managers in government and beyond now have a clear directive for manage in place, with automation invisibly to end users. It took 13 years from the Note for File report, but standalone EDRMS, with their low adoption, productivity impacts, and management complexity, have been effectively relegated. If we have automated, invisible records management, do we even need records managers? Let me share some case studies which show that when using any kind of AI, we actually need records managers more now than before. All approaches to AI for records management need records managers, but there are key differences in how they're utilised. In 2020, a federal agency implemented an AI EDRMS using a combined rules tree with a machine learning model. In this model, if a record could not be categorised by a rule, the machine learning model classified the record based on its contents. The statistical model was developed by taking a set of records that first had to be manually classified and then applying natural language processing techniques to normalise the document content into vectors. The model was then trained using algorithms. This process required significant input from the records managers, both to classify the training dataset, design and then maintain the rules engine, and then to train the AI. Generally, supervised machine learning requires a minimum of 1,000 good examples for each rule. So to train an ML, the records team needs to find and curate 1,000 examples at least for each function activity pair in the records authority. They then need to supervise the learning, confirming yes or no to each suggested match. This process is very time-consuming for records teams, especially when the organisation has hundreds of separate rules, and it also requires significant and ongoing effort from the vendor to build and refine. The implementation reported 80% accuracy, which is not within the expected reliability for AI classification, which aims for 90%. It was unable to classify based on context as well as content. It also only indicated a 5% productivity gain to the organisation. So this is an example of which AI did not make records managers a vital part of the process, but not in an efficient way. And eventually the agency did lose their records manager and outsourced the function entirely to the ML vendor. We call this kind of AI a mechanical Turk. It looks on the outside like a robot playing chess, but there's actually a person inside pulling all the levers. This doesn't play to the strengths of people or machines. However, we also now have dozens of examples of AI records management in government and regulated industry that also require skilled and dedicated records teams to oversee, but in a very different capacity. Supervised machine learning is not the only type of AI. Rules as code is the modern global standard for regulatory AI, and as well as removing burden from records teams, it's also transparent and traceable, which algorithmic models are not. If you remember back to earlier in this session, Treasury was one of the agencies audited in 2012. At that time, they reported having one EDRMS and 177 other business systems. The EDRMS was 8 years old and had very limited adoption. Now they use AI to compliantly manage their business systems with over 95% accuracy and to support strategic management and business intelligence work by the agency. The implementation includes identification of high-risk data and proactive security reporting. AI has allowed Treasury to refresh its strategic approach to record keeping by enabling it to manage information and records at the enterprise level. The records team now have a direct strategic input at the highest levels of the agency, as they provide advice on not only what has value and should be retained, but also what has risk, where it is, who's doing what to it, and whether it should be further protected or lawfully disposed of. In a model where the AI uses true automation with traceable and transparent AI, records managers can and must leave their silo and expand their remit beyond classification and sentencing. For example, to participate more fully in the cybersecurity function. In 2021, a large university identified they'd been the target of a malicious breach in which a significant amount of information had been exposed. They needed to urgently understand what the exposure was. The organisation implemented AI on the network, which rapidly registered over 30,000 systems containing more than 7 million items, and then indexed and classified around 200 systems in scope of the breach. The team also rapidly coded a secrecy provisions ontology from acts and regulations specific to the uni and a records authority to identify which of the spilled data should have already been disposed of, which goes to liability. These rules were applied automatically over all the data and identified the full scope of the breach, as well as the impacts in terms of potential civil and criminal penalties, privacy implications, and harm to procedural integrity. All of that was done by Saturday afternoon. The information was used by the records team to inform the executive and plan the response and recovery. They were able to determine the scope of the breach, as well as the impact and the recommended mitigations. They then expanded the solution to actively manage 59,000 systems for audit, discovery, and compliance. And they now use AI to help prevent and detect breaches, as well as respond to them. Records managers can also more effectively support legal discovery using AI. In 2021, a state government department had identified systemic failings in its management of reports of inappropriate behaviour by staff in the health and youth services. Reviews had found that reports made were not acted on for many years, and deficiencies in linking reports together between systems, across departments, allowed abusers to escape notice. AI was implemented by the records team to find key terms related to abuse and misconduct across multiple large business systems, and could do so with 100% accuracy, finding 60,000 matches that were previously not detected or detectable. To close, AI will not replace records managers. Instead, it makes them indispensable, but they can be used for low-value work or for high-value work, depending on the type of AI employed. To succeed in making information available to only the right people at the right time, including to future generations where appropriate, we first need to know our own data. We need to understand what we have, where it is, and who's doing what to it, what risk and value the information has, and what rules apply to its handling and preservation, and whether those rules are being met. And we have to do all this invisibly and automatically, so we need to do much more than we have been and do less at the same time. To understand how to achieve this, we need to understand the manage in place model and how it fundamentally changes our relationship with archives. We also need to understand those different types of automation now available using AI and other machine capabilities and make good choices about which we adopt. Understanding the role of the records professional in the age of AI is vital to knowing who we are and what we will become. The landscape of information control is changing very quickly, and we need to change with it, not just to keep up with what we have been doing, but to go beyond, to a model where our governance is integrated across the enterprise and is considering information risk as well as value. Thank you.
It's a shame we don't have Rachael with us because that was super interesting, and I'm sure we've got some burning questions for her, but that's a shame. But